Lecture 28, Tristan and Isolt.
Well, I'd like to welcome you once again to this series of lectures on the literatures of Europe's Middle Ages. The fourth in our series confronts us with the star-crossed lovers Tristan and Isolt, and with them we enter the world of romance. Now, romance is a 12th century French invention. That is, romance is a literary form. One suspects that romance has been around a bit longer than that. Anyway, romance is a 12th century French invention. In our next lecture, we'll actually consider the greatest of all the French romances, indeed the greatest of all the romances, the Romance of the Rose. In this lecture, we're going to look at the origins of romance, and then we're going to turn to the greatest of the German romances, Tristan and Isolt, or Tristan und Isolde. It's important to bear in mind that there survived more than 200 French romances, about 100 each in English and Italian, more than 50 in German and Spanish. So there's a lot of romances. Now, the road to romance passes through the lyric poetry of the troubadours and the trouvères. Okay, who are they? We've already seen that medieval epic, the chanson de geste, the song of deeds, tended to focus on the remote Germanic past, or else on the world of Charlemagne. At the dawn of the 12th century, lyric poets in the south of France turned away from historical themes to sing songs of love. Troubadours in the south of France, from Provençal, trobar, to invent, as in trobar, to find, meaning really to invent, to make, to create, beginning with Count William IX of Poitou and Aquitaine, who reigned from 1071 until 1127, created a new kind of poetry. By the middle of the 12th century, conventions of southern poetry appeared in the north, in the poetry of the trouvères. Compare modern French trouver, to find. It's the same word as trobar. We know the names of more than 450 troubadours and some 200 trouvères, and many of these, in fact, are women. This is a new note in our music. The love lyrics which these poets composed were aristocratic, courtly, textually creative. The sheer power of the language in this poetry is amazing, and often obscure. Obscure allusions, obscure language, obscure grammar and syntax. And one does wonder a little bit about that obscurity. One sometimes has the impression, indeed maybe perhaps a very strong impression, that these guys were talking to each other, that there were a lot of wink-wink in-jokes going on here, or if not jokes, at any rate, in things, references, allusions that they expected one another to catch, but not necessarily us, and not necessarily even their contemporaries. Now, the basic ethos of this poetry has long been called courtly love. That's a term that is very difficult to define or to pin down. There are certain life ideals that are pretty much always present. Skill in fighting and hunting, nobility of character, skill at social interaction, learning, refinement, a taste for luxury. But ideals of love are crucial too. No one who did not love could be fully courtly. Love and desire are essentially the same. Love at once seeks and dreads satisfaction. So, for example, there could be no love in marriage because satisfaction is always available. Love is a mixture of pleasure and suffering. The woman is usually of higher social status than the man who loves her and who serves her. It's also true that in this literature of courtly love, we see a rather interesting transformation of the chivalric code. Now, chivalry, chevalerie in French, from French cheval, horse, horsiness is really what chivalry means, is guy stuff. It's about a world of warriors. It's a world of Roland and of Beowulf. Women are invisible, basically, in those poems. This is not about them. And it's not about how men relate to women. But in the courtly literature of the 12th century, what we find is not the warrior but the gentleman, a man who displays gentility in his conduct regarding women. Now, one of the things that these gentlemen always are is courteous. Now, courtesy, courtoisie, essentially courtiness, how to behave at court. Well, we could go back to Cid. We could talk about Garcia Ordóñez and so on. We could talk about the politics of the court. There's a lot of ways to behave in a court. You can think of great law scenes, trials, like the trial of Ganelon or the trial of the Infantes of Carrion. But the courtiness of courtly literature is a world of refinement, of music and dancing and singing and games and beautiful clothing and all of that sort of thing. A very different kind of courtiness. Hence, courtesy, you see, is not again an affair of warriors, but an affair of gentlemen, and gentlemen in the presence of ladies. Now, there's been a lot of controversy over the years about the sources and the meaning of this love poetry. Some, for example, have suggested, and there's certainly merit in the suggestion, that the love poetry of classical poets, in particular Ovid, may be crucial here. Others point to the emergence in the vernacular, in French, in Italian, in German, of classically inspired love lyrics of the medieval clerical schools. Now, we find, for instance, let's say, among Cistercian monks in the 12th century, beautiful and moving love songs to the Virgin Mary. Well, is it a long leap to go from there to the quite frequently immoral lyrics of the troubadours and trouvères, or do we see there a kind of a link, a kind of a connection? It's an interesting problem. There are others who argue for Arabic influences coming from Spain. Now, the more people look at this, the more they say it may bear on the form of the poetry, but probably not on its content. A few still maintain that old popular poetry is behind the new poetry. Here we have our traditionalists or our oralists, as we've met them in our earlier lectures. Well, I don't think those arguments with respect to this poetry are any more valid or plausible than with respect to the great epics that we have talked about already in this series of lectures. But where the love poetry is concerned, one must confront the oralist or the traditionalist with these questions. Why is this stuff so learned, so intricate, and so aristocratic, if it's in fact some kind of old popular poetry? Now, it's also true that historians will sometimes point to general social conditions involving life in castles, involving the presence of large numbers of young men, the younger sons of members of the nobility, who were seeking fame, who were seeking wealth, who were seeking a lord, who were seeking a wife. Some of these elements, in other words, that we encounter in Beowulf, that we encounter in Roland, that we encounter in El Cid, really do mirror things that we see out there in the real world. So there's no reason to suppose that the kinds of things that we meet in the poetry of the troubadours and the trouvères don't also mirror things that we see in the real world. There are also some very interesting problems surrounding the proper interpretation of this poetry because it so manifestly flaunts the conventions of Christian and feudal society. Is this poetry ironic? This poetry is full of adultery and betrayal. Now, for heaven's sakes, how are those two things being held up as ideals? Or is the whole point that the poetry is saying, don't do this, this is wrong? Is this poetry, in a reverse kind of way, a searing condemnation of sensualism, immorality, and betrayal? That's an interesting question, too. In other words, we're meant to take it seriously, but not literally. Does this poetry allow women powerful and dynamic roles? Sometimes it seems so. Does it place women on pedestals and make them loved and admired from afar as fine porcelain things that would break very easily? Does it mock women? Does it mock them? Whatever we may think about this new poetry, it put love and courtly behavior at the center of literary production. Now, around the middle of the 12th century, the Romance, from Old French mettre en romance, literally to translate into French, made its appearance. Now, you all know that the Romance languages are French and Italian and Spanish and so on. Well, in the Middle Ages, mettre en romance in France particularly meant to translate into French, though, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, there are numerous romances in several different languages. But that's the origin of the term, of the Romance. So it's a literary form, not a kind of human relationship. The Romance was an amalgam of two bodies of source material. As to content, the Romance drew on classical themes. Stories about Troy, about Thebes, about Alexander, about Aeneas. These stories were told and retold and cycled and recycled. We're going to bump into them a little bit in this lecture, and we're going to bump into them rather frequently in some of our later lectures. Or else, the Romances drew on the matter of Britain, stories about King Arthur and his court. Now, as to ethos, Romance drew on lyric poetry. It drew on the work of the troubadours and the trouvères, and it put love themes at the center of almost every story. In other words, here is where they differ, for example, from the epics that we've considered already. These romances are sometimes set in the same kind of world, and there are great warriors in them, and there are sometimes fights and sometimes battles, but love themes are right at the center of the romance. Romances are full of magic and enchantment. Not Christian miracle, but magic and enchantment. Themes of journey or themes of quest are very, very common, and perhaps suggest some of the ways in which one should interpret these romances. We're seeking something better than what we have. We're imagining a brighter tomorrow. We're imagining a different world. Mistaken identities and disguises are very common in the romances. We find those themes again and again and again. Now, in the 12th century, romances were in verse, typically in octosyllabic lines. That means 8-syllable lines. But by the 13th century, we actually see prose romances beginning to emerge. Now, writers of romances borrowed very freely from their common sources and also from each other. So often one meets the same characters in different situations or similar situations that are handled somewhat differently. Anyone who has read very much Arthurian literature, for example, knows that the various Arthurian knights have their common characteristics in one story after another, and then sometimes surprising differences among them. This is not unlike classical literature, where we meet, for example, the pagan gods of the Greeks and Romans, and we find them doing some jobs and representing some things in some stories and doing different jobs and representing other things in other stories. There are some scholars who actually despair of talking about romance as a coherent genre of literature. That is to say, there's such diversity, such complexity, that it's really hard to say that there is this thing called romance and that that's a useful label to describe a whole body of material. I think that is an excessively negative position. I think one can't quite legitimately talk about romance, but one has to realize that in doing so, one is talking about a large and rich and complex body of material. The greatest 12th century writer of French romances, and one of the greatest of the writers of romances in the Middle Ages, was Chrétien de Troyes, Christian of Troyes. This is a very interesting puzzle, too. Why exactly is he called Chrétien? Nowadays, Christian, Christine are relatively common names, but Chrétien was not a common name in the Middle Ages. You didn't particularly call somebody Christian because that was more or less taken for granted. Well, anyway, we know almost nothing about Chrétien de Troyes personally. His major works, scholars believe, were composed between about 1159 and about 1191. He was patronized by the Countess of Champagne and then by the Count of Flanders. His romances are all Arthurian, but they deal with figures from Arthur's court, not with Arthur himself. Now, the Arthurian materials, Arthurian literature, of course, had been percolating in the British Isles in Cornwall and in western France, Brittany, for a very long time. And then across the course of the 12th and on into the 13th century, the stuff just explodes, and one begins to find it everywhere. Now, in the opening of Chrétien's romance, The Knight of the Cart, which is a story of the adulterous affair of Lancelot and Guinevere, Arthur's queen, Chrétien says this: "Since my lady of Champagne," he means Marie, the daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine and wife of Count Henry the Liberal of Champagne, "since she wills me to undertake the making of a romance, I shall undertake it with great good will, as one so wholly devoted that he will do anything in the world for her without any intention of flattery." But later he goes on, Christian is beginning his book of The Knight of the Cart. The Countess presents him with the matter and the meaning, and he undertakes to shape the work, adding little to it except his effort and his careful attention. Well, maybe not. We see here the role of the patroness and her court. You know, a guy like Chrétien de Troyes, in a sense, is a pro. He does this for a living. He gets paid to do it. So he's got to find patrons, all right? He finds these patrons in courts, because there are, of course, the audiences for the kinds of stories that he has to tell. So we see the world of patronage articulated here very clearly. We also see a conceit of many of the romances. A lady dictated the theme. Chrétien just kind of writes it down. Marie of Champagne has told him what to write. Well, it's probably imprudent simply to discard, to disbelieve that notion, but it's probably imprudent to take it too seriously. It may be a form of flattery. After all, you're flattering the person who, in a sense, pays you. But it may also be an example of an old literary artifice, that is to say, the modesty topos. Oh, poor me, I haven't the ability to make such a wonderful thing, but if you'll just give me a hearing, maybe I can entertain you just a bit. Work after work after work after work in the Western tradition is marked at the beginning by a modesty topos or humility topos like that. So it's possible that this is the sort of thing that we actually see in Chrétien de Troyes. Now, Chrétien's romances were profoundly influential. We're going to see later on that they influenced Dante, they influenced Boccaccio. We're going to find them turning up all over the place. There is considerable evidence, I think, that they also influenced the author of El Cid, Parabat, or whoever wrote that poem. And Chrétien did indeed write a romance about Tristan and Isolt, but it doesn't survive. So let's turn instead to the masterpiece by Gottfried von Strassburg. About Gottfried, alas, nothing is known. He wrote his Tristan about 1200, maybe as late as 1210, according to kind of scholarly detective work. But we really can't say that that is absolutely certain. And again, there is this puzzle. We just don't know anything about Gottfried. We don't know anything else that he wrote, if indeed he wrote anything else. Romance entered Germany from France in the middle of the 12th century. Gottfried almost certainly knew the works of Chrétien. Nevertheless, he patterned his own Tristan on one written by Thomas of England. Not a household name, Thomas of England, who may have been an author at the court of King Henry II of England and his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose daughter Marie, we just met a moment ago as the patroness of Chrétien de Troyes. Thomas's work survives only in fragments, so we can't really fully compare Gottfried's with it and see where did he change, where did he add, where did he delete, and so on. We just can't make a full textual comparison. Gottfried's Tristan takes us into the Arthurian world, but it deals with Cornwall and Ireland rather than with the familiar figures of the Round Table. Now we can summarize Gottfried's lengthy poem, 19,548 verses. I mean, this gives you about a little over 6 Beowulfs, for instance. So we may summarize it as follows. It's a very rich and complex tale, and great good fun, too. Gottfried foreshadows his main story by telling us about, it's as it were, it's a flashback within a story which is itself set in the olden days. He flashes back to tell us about Tristan's parents. His mother was Blanchefleur, White Flower, the sister of King Mark. His father was Count Rivalen. Now they fell deeply in love, but Rivalen was killed treacherously in battle, and Blanchefleur died of grief as she was giving birth to their son Tristan. Now Tristan was raised by his father's faithful servant Rual, and for a long time he didn't know who he really was. Nobody really knew who he was. Now here is a very common thing in romances, mistaken identities and people who turn out to be other than who everyone always thought they were, and so forth. Well, Tristan grows up to be learned, musical, talented, admired by everyone. We see these conventions of courtliness marked very clearly by the character of Tristan. Now, finally, his uncle Mark recognized him and knighted him. Tristan then sets out to avenge his father's death. Now, here we get the themes of honor that we've come to expect. We also discover that Tristan may be musical and he may be literary and he may be artistic and all of that, but the guy also can fight. You know, a knight who can't fight is useless, at least certainly useless in a male world. Anyway, he does avenge his father, and then he comes back and returns to Mark's service. Now, to make Mark's realm secure, we may be reminded here almost of Beowulf, he has to fight and kill an Irish giant named Morholt. Now, in a quite remarkable battle scene, little Tristan kind of cleverly defeats this Irish giant, whacks him in the head with his sword, and leaves a notch from his sword blade in Morholt's skull. That little notch from that sword blade is going to come back in a moment. But in the course of fighting with Morholt, Tristan is dealt a blow, a poisoned blow, that can only be cured by Ireland's Queen Isolt. Well, Tristan disguises himself as a musician and calls himself Tantris, just turns his name around, and he goes off to Ireland. Well, he ingratiates himself to everyone. He's cured, and then he's appointed by Isolt to tutor her daughter, whose name, somewhat confusingly, is also Isolt. She's only one of 3 Isolts in this poem, but anyway. What is he going to teach her? He's going to teach her music, singing, letters, philosophy, Latin, French, and courtly culture. Now, I don't think anyone would expect to find anything like that in Beowulf or in Roland, for example. So we have a sense, again, of the kinds of things that the proper gentleman of romance is supposed to know. Well, ever loyal, Tristan eventually returns to King Mark, tells him of Isolt, goes on and on and on about her beauty, and promises that he, Tristan, will woo Isolt for Mark. So he returns to Ireland, only to learn that the king has promised his daughter to anyone who can kill a loathsome dragon. Well, Tristan does so, and he cuts out the beast's tongue to be able to take it back and show it as proof that he's killed the dragon. But he sticks the tongue inside his shirt, and the tongue sort of poisons him, and he swoons and falls down asleep. Meanwhile, the king's cupbearer, one of his minor court officials, comes by, sees the dragon lying there dead, cuts off its head, and takes the head back to court and claims the prize, that is to say, the king's daughter Isolt, so that he wants to marry her. Well, eventually, predictably perhaps, Tristan recovers, and he comes back to court, and he reveals the cupbearer's deception by producing the tongue of the dragon. And perfectly clear, he couldn't have that tongue unless he had been the one who had killed the dragon. So he's welcomed into the palace, and everyone is delighted to see him. And he's bathing. And when he's bathing, his weapons are laid to one side, and Isolt comes into the room and notices the notch in his sword, and notices that the notch in his sword exactly matches the piece of sword that had been taken from her uncle Morholt's head. So now she wants to kill Tristan because he's killed her uncle. Well, Isolt's mother, Isolt, patches up peace between Isolt and Tristan, and they agree that she can go off and marry King Mark. Well, Isolt is sad to be leaving home. She's sad to be leaving with her uncle's killer. And aware of her distress, her mother gave her servant Brangæna a love potion, which, when Isolt reached Mark's palace and was duly married to Mark, she was to drink, so that they would fall in love with one another. Well, when the boat came into sight of land, Tristan called out that everyone should have a drink of wine. The serving maiden inadvertently served the love potion instead of the wine. Tristan and Isolt drink the love potion and, of course, fall hopelessly in love. Well, the rest of the story deals in a variety of ways, sometimes really quite beautiful and moving, sometimes rather humorous, but deals in a variety of ways with their deception of King Mark, Mark's eventual discovery of their love, and his pardon of them, although he does require Tristan to leave his kingdom. Gottfried's version ends there. Well, his unfinished version actually has Tristan leaving the kingdom and meeting a woman called Isolt of the White Hands, our third Isolt in this particular poem. Several other writers at one time or another added various endings to the tale, so the story ends in various ways. The story poses a number of very interesting problems for critics, and it always has. For instance, is it unfinished because Gottfried simply didn't know how to finish it? It is, after all, if you think about it. I mean, exercise your own imagination here. You've got the basic lineaments of the story. What are you going to do once Mark has pardoned Tristan and Isolt and required Tristan to leave the kingdom? I mean, how would you end it? I mean, it may very well be that, and this was already over 19,000 lines long, it was already a big poem, maybe that the poet really wasn't quite sure what to do. What's the moral of the story? Is the moral of the story that one must adopt a kind of an air of resignation in the face of inevitable disappointment? That things will never turn out right? That we're not really in control of our destiny? That we simply have to accept? We have to sort of be resigned? Is that the point here? In other words, this very clever, remarkable Tristan and this wise, just, prudent Mark, are they simply victims of circumstances and not at all in control of their circumstances? Is there in some way a theological message encoded there? Is the story a utopian idealization of pure love? The love of Blanchefleur and Rivelin, the love of Tristan and Isolt. If so, what's the point of the love potion? This is a very interesting little puzzle. Again, think about the story and ask yourself, do I need that love potion? Can't I simply have Tristan and Isolt fall in love with one another? If their love is something that is beyond human will, then what role has will in love? If the purpose of the love potion is in some way to elevate their love beyond the human plane, to put it in some other realm, then what is the nature of actual love? Is all seeming love really a deception? It's a very interesting problem. Why do we need the love potion? This is a story of adultery. And the cuckolded husband, Mark, is a sympathetic figure. Yet Gottfried's sympathies, and ours, are with Tristan and Isolt. Now, I don't want to turn them into sort of medieval Bonnie and Clyde, but the point is that one ought, by all that's right and just and holy, you see, to sympathize with Mark. And yet we really come away feeling badly for Tristan and Isolt. Is the work intended to criticize conventional court culture and the conventions of courtly love? Mark that point well. Does it uphold or criticize the conventions of courtly love? Is the whole thing cast in a kind of an ironic mode? In other words, we're not supposed to like these people. We're not supposed to admire these people. We're not supposed to agree with, accept, succumb to the values which are put on display before us. Is the point perhaps that true love is not a courtly entertainment, but something so pure, so refined, so powerful, that it can't be integrated into normal society? Is love inevitably destructive? Is that the point here? Is Gottfried inviting us to compare a love that is subject to reason with a love that is irrational, in equal measures sublime and destructive? What's he trying to tell us about the nature of love? Is he trying to tell us about the nature of love? Do we demand of him that he tell us something about the nature of love? Is he really just telling us a jolly good story? And we're not supposed to try to make too much of it. Well, as with all great works of art, this one's possibilities are inexhaustible. The next text to which we will turn is even larger and even more inexhaustible, the Romance of the Rose.